A 1904 family portrait has been unearthed, and historians are left stunned after enhancing the image to reveal a peculiar detail in the child's hand. The golden afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Oklahoma Historical Society archives in Oklahoma City, casting extended shadows over rows of filing cabinets that held over a century's worth of forgotten narratives. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian with a focus on early 20th century African American communities, carefully lifted a dusty cardboard box from the shelf. Her hands, shielded by white cotton gloves, trembled slightly with anticipation. For 3 months, she had been sorting through photographic collections donated by estates from across the state. This particular box had arrived just 2 weeks earlier, sent by the descendants of a Tulsa family. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, she discovered what seemed to be a simple family photograph. The image showed a gathering in a park with a date written in faded ink on the back, June 12, 1904, Standpipe Hill. Sarah's breath caught. Standpipe Hill had once been part of the vibrant Greenwood District, the area later renowned as Black Wall Street, before its tragic destruction in 1921. Yet this photograph predated that catastrophe by 17 years, capturing a moment of prosperity and joy that few visual records had managed to preserve. The photo depicted around 15 individuals arranged in 3 rows. The adults wore their finest Sunday attire, men in dark suits with stiff collars, women in white blouses with high necklines and long skirts, brushing the grass. Children sat cross-legged in the front, their faces glowing with the carefree happiness of a summer afternoon. Behind them, a checkered blanket had been spread across the ground, and Sarah could discern the outlines of picnic baskets and what appeared to be a wooden crate. She carried the photograph to her workstation and placed it beneath the magnifying lamp. The image quality was remarkable for its age. The photographer had captured extraordinary detail, from the embroidery on a woman's collar to the individual blades of grass in the foreground. As she studied the faces, trying to envision the lives behind those steady gazes, her attention was drawn to a boy seated in the center of the front row. He appeared to be about 8 years old, with clothes, cropped hair, and an expression that seemed unusually solemn compared to the other children. She adjusted the lamp and leaned closer. The boy's right hand rested on his knee, and there was something there. Something small and metallic that caught the light. Sarah reached for her digital scanner, her heart beginning to pound with the familiar thrill of discovery. She had long known that photographs from this era often held secrets invisible to the casual observer, details that only emerged under close scrutiny. Sarah uploaded the scanned image to her computer and opened the photo enhancement software. As the high-resolution file loaded, she zoomed in on the boy's hand, increasing the magnification until the pixels started to separate into distinct shapes. What she saw made her sit back abruptly in her chair, her mind racing to make sense of the impossible. Pinned to the boy's shirt, just above where his hand rested, was a small badge. It was roughly circular, no larger than a quarter, and appeared to be made of brass or bronze. But it was the design on the badge that had frozen Sarah in place. Even through the grain of the century-old photograph, she could make out a series of symbols etched into the metal, an open book, a torch, and beneath them, what looked like interlocking circles or links of a chain. The symbolism was unmistakable to anyone familiar with educational iconography. The book represented knowledge, the torch enlightenment. But the chain links were what troubled her. This particular combination of symbols wouldn't become associated with African-American educational movements until decades later, during the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s. Yet here it was, clearly visible in a photograph from 1904. pinned to a child's shirt at a family gathering in Oklahoma. Sarah pulled up her research files on early African-American education in Oklahoma Territory. In 1904, Jim Crow laws were firmly entrenched. Schools were strictly segregated, and black schools received a fraction of the funding allocated to white institutions. The books were hand-me-downs, the buildings often little more than one-room shacks. It was a time when literacy itself was an act of resistance, when education was both treasured and constrained by a system designed to limit opportunity. She enlarged the image further, examining every detail of the badge. The craftsmanship appeared deliberate, not crude or hastily made. Someone had designed this symbol with care and intention. Around the edge of the badge, she could just barely make out what might be letters or numbers, but the resolution wasn't quite high enough to read them clearly. Sarah glanced at the clock. It was nearly 6:00 in the evening, and the building would be closing soon. She saved her work and made copies of the enhanced images, her mind already planning the next steps. Tomorrow, she would bring in specialized equipment from the university lab, the kind used for forensic analysis of historical documents. But tonight, she needed to do something else first. She pulled the photograph from its protective sleeve once more and turned it over. On the back, beneath the date, someone had written a list of names in careful script. The handwriting was faded but legible, written in the formal, cursive style common to the era. Sarah carefully transcribed the names into her notebook. Thomas, age 35, Ruth, age 32, Samuel, age 14, Grace, age 12, Daniel, age 8, Esther, age 6. The list continued, documenting 15 individuals in total with ages and what appeared to be their relationships to one another. Daniel, age 8. Sarah's pulse quickened. That had to be the boy with the mysterious badge. She continued reading the notation beside his name. Daniel, son of Thomas and Ruth, Greenwood School. She turned to her computer and opened the digital archives of the Tulsa City Directory from 1904. The records were incomplete. Many African-American families had been underrepresented or omitted entirely from official documentation. But she searched anyway, typing in Thomas and Greenwood. After several frustrating attempts, with different spelling variations, she found a single entry: Thomas Carpenter, Greenwood District Carpenter. Sarah sat back, considering this information. In 1904, Greenwood was just beginning its transformation into the prosperous business district it would become. African Americans were building not just homes and shops, but an entire community infrastructure: churches, schools, businesses. A skilled carpenter would have been essential to that growth. And clearly, based on the clothing in the photograph, Thomas had been successful enough to provide well for his family. But what about the badge? Sarah opened a new search window and began looking for references to educational organizations, fraternal societies, or community groups that might have operated in Oklahoma Territory during that period. She found mentions of churches organizing Sunday schools, informal reading groups meeting in private homes, and determined parents pooling resources to hire teachers for their children. But nowhere did she find any reference to a symbol like the one on Daniel's badge. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the archives an hour before opening, carrying a case of specialized photographic equipment borrowed from her colleague in the university's forensic document laboratory. She set up the camera with its macro lens and arranged the lighting to eliminate glare. Then, with painstaking care, she photographed every millimeter of the original image, creating a series of ultra-high-resolution captures that she could layer and analyze. By noon, she had assembled a composite image with 10 times the detail of her initial scan. She zoomed in on the badge again, and this time the letters around its edge became visible: NEN 1899. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she typed the abbreviation into her search engine. NEN. What could it stand for? She tried various combinations: Negro Education Network, National Educational Network, Negro Enlightenment Network. Nothing returned relevant results from that time period. Sarah spent the afternoon combing through historical databases, academic journals, and archived newspapers from Oklahoma Territory and surrounding states. The abbreviation NEN appeared nowhere in the official record, which only deepened the mystery. Organizations from that era, especially those serving African American communities, typically left some trace: meeting minutes in church records, advertisements in Black-owned newspapers, corporation documents filed with territorial authorities. But NEN was a ghost. Frustrated, she decided to approach the problem from another angle. She pulled up census records from 1900 and 1910, searching for the family members listed on the back of the photograph. Thomas appeared in the 1900 census as a 29-year-old carpenter living in Tulsa with his wife Ruth and 2 children. By 1910, the family had grown, and Thomas was listed as a building contractor with property valued at $2,000, a substantial sum for a black family in Oklahoma at that time. But it was the entry for Daniel that caught her attention. In the 1910 census, taken when he would have been 14, his occupation was listed as student. The census taker had made a small notation in the margin, "Private Academy." Sarah leaned forward, her heart racing. Private academy. In 1910, segregated public schools were the norm in Oklahoma, but private academies specifically for African American children were extremely rare and usually operated in secret or under the guise of church programs. The notation suggested that Daniel had access to educational opportunities far beyond what was typically available to black children in the region. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Marcus Williams, a colleague at Howard University who specialized in African American educational history. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice warm and curious when she explained what she had found. "NEN from 1899. Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "That's before Oklahoma even became a state. During that period, there were definitely underground educational networks operating throughout the South and border territories. Freedmen's Bureau schools had mostly closed by then, and Jim Crow was tightening its grip. Some communities developed their own systems, passing knowledge from person to person, operating schools that deliberately flew under the radar. But would they have had identifying badges?" Sarah asked. "Something children would wear openly." There was a long pause. "Not openly. No, that would have been dangerous. But within the community, at private gatherings, it's possible." These networks needed ways to identify trusted members, to know who could be approached safely about education for their children. A small symbol worn at specific times could serve that purpose. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Marcus, what if this wasn't just an informal network? What if this was organized, structured, operating across multiple communities? "Then you found something that's been hidden for over a century," Marcus said quietly, "and someone went to great lengths to keep it that way." That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment with the photograph and her research notes spread across the dining table. The late autumn rain tapped against the windows. As she studied the faces in the image once more, trying to see beyond the formal poses and Sunday clothes to the lives these people had lived, she focused on Ruth, Daniel's mother, who stood in the back row with her hand resting on her husband's shoulder. Ruth's expression was composed, almost serene, but there was something in her eyes, a sharpness, an intelligence, that suggested a woman who missed nothing. Sarah zoomed in on Ruth's collar and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small pin similar in size to Daniel's badge, but shaped differently. It appeared to be a simple brooch, the kind women wore to fasten their high collars. But when Sarah enhanced the image further, she could see the same symbols: the book, the torch, and the interlocking links. Ruth was part of it too. Whatever NN represented, it wasn't just for children or just for men. This was a family commitment, perhaps even a community-wide movement. Sarah opened her laptop and began searching for Ruth specifically, trying variations of the name combined with Tulsa and teacher. After nearly an hour, she found a brief mention in a 1908 issue of the Tulsa Star, one of the city's African-American newspapers. The article, reporting on a church social, mentioned Mrs. Ruth of Greenwood, who has been instructing the young people in literature and arithmetic. Instructing the young people, not as a licensed teacher, which would have required certification from the territorial government, something virtually impossible for a black woman to obtain in 1908, Oklahoma. This was informal education, the kind that happened in homes and churches away from official scrutiny. Sarah's phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was Marcus calling back. "I've been thinking about what you found," he said without preamble. "I made some calls to colleagues who work with oral histories from Oklahoma's black communities. One of them remembered a story her grandmother used to tell about the badge people, educators who wore secret symbols to identify themselves to families seeking schooling for their children. The grandmother said her own mother had been part of it back before statehood." Sarah's breath caught. Did she say anything else? Anything about what the organization was called? "She called them the night school," Marcus replied. "Not because they met at night, but because they operated in the shadows, invisible to white authorities. She said they had a network that stretched from Texas to Kansas, operating in border communities where black families had some economic independence but faced severe educational restrictions. The night school. The pieces were beginning to fit together. NEN could stand for Negro Education Network, exactly as Sarah had guessed. But it represented something far more sophisticated than she had imagined. A coordinated effort spanning multiple states, operating for years beneath the notice of those who would have shut it down. The following Monday, Sarah requested leave from her regular duties at the Historical Society to pursue the investigation full-time. Her supervisor, Dr. Helen Garcia, listened intently as Sarah presented everything she had discovered, her eyes widening as the implications became clear. "If this is real," Helen said slowly, "if there was an organized underground educational network operating in Oklahoma territory before statehood, this changes our understanding of African-American resistance and community building in the region. This needs to be documented properly." Helen approved 3 weeks of dedicated research time and arranged for Sarah to access additional resources, including funds to travel and interview potential descendants of the family in the photograph. Sarah's first stop would be Tulsa, where she hoped to find records in church archives and local historical societies that might have escaped the destruction of the 1921 massacre. 2 days later, Sarah drove north to Tulsa under gray November skies. The city had changed dramatically since 1904, rebuilt and expanded far beyond the boundaries of the old Greenwood District. But echoes of that vanished neighborhood remained. Historical markers, rebuilt churches, the Greenwood Cultural Center, dedicated to preserving the memory of Black Wall Street. She began her research at Vernon Church, one of the oldest African-American churches in Tulsa. The current building dated from the 1950s, but the congregation had existed since the 1890s, and the church maintained an archive of records that had been rescued from the original building before its destruction. The archivist, an elderly man named Robert, listened to Sarah's explanation with growing interest. When she showed him the enhanced image of Daniel's badge, his expression changed to something between recognition and disbelief. "My grandmother had something like that," he said quietly. "She kept it in a wooden box with her Bible. I saw it when I was a boy after she passed." We didn't know what it meant, just that it had been important to her. My mother said she had been a teacher back before schools were integrated, but she wouldn't say much more than that. Sarah's heart raced. "Do you still have the badge?" Robert shook his head regretfully. "My mother was told to get rid of everything after the massacre. Anything that might identify families as educated or organized or prosperous. It made you a target. She buried most of my grandmother's papers in the backyard, and they were ruined by the time anyone thought to dig them up. But I remember what the badge looked like. The book and the torch with chains linking them together." "Not chains," Sarah said softly. "Links. Connections between people, between communities, a network." Robert nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "She used to tell me, education is the chain that can't be broken, no matter how hard they try." I always thought she meant it metaphorically. Robert led Sarah deeper into the church archive, a climate-controlled room in the basement filled with filing cabinets and acid-free storage boxes. He pulled out several ledgers from the early 1900s. Membership rolls, baptismal records, meeting minutes from church committees. Sarah handled them carefully, aware she was touching documents that had survived against enormous odds. The original church building was destroyed in 1921. Robert explained as Sarah examined the ledgers, but Reverend Ellis, who was pastor at the time, managed to save some records. He carried them out in a trunk while the neighborhood was burning. My grandmother helped him hide them in a root cellar outside the city, until it was safe to return. Sarah found an entry from September 1903 that made her pause. Education Committee meeting, 7 members present. Discussion of curriculum expansion and recruitment of new instructors. Motion passed to create identification system for certified participants. Education Committee, Sarah murmured. "That's unusually formal for a church program." "The church was the center of everything back then," Robert said. "If you wanted to organize something in the black community, you did it through the church. It provided cover, made it look like religious education, instead of what it actually was." Sarah photographed the page, then continued through the ledger. Several entries mentioned the Education Committee, always briefly, never with detailed minutes. But in January 1904, she found a longer notation. Committee reports successful expansion to 3 additional churches in the territory. The NEM program now serves 127 children across 5 communities. Badge distribution completed for new participants. There it was, mentioned directly in church records, tied to an organized educational program operating across multiple communities. Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with awe at what she was uncovering. Robert leaned over her shoulder, reading the entry. 127 children, he said softly. "That's substantial for that time period. Someone put serious resources and planning into this." Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon photographing relevant pages from the church archives. When she finished, Robert invited her to his home to meet his Aunt Lorraine, who was 92 and had been born in Greenwood just after the massacre. They drove through North Tulsa as the afternoon light faded, past blocks of modest homes and churches. Robert's house was a small bungalow with a well-tended garden. Inside, Lorraine sat in a recliner near the window, a quilt across her lap. Her eyes were sharp and alert as Robert introduced Sarah and explained why she had come. Sarah showed Lorraine the photograph, and the older woman's hands trembled slightly as she held it. "That's Standpipe Hill," she said immediately. "Before everything was destroyed. My mother used to tell me about picnics up there, how you could see the whole city spread out below you. Did your mother ever mention the badges? Sarah asked gently. The Nen. Lorraine looked up sharply. Where did you hear that name? Lorraine set the photograph down carefully and was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but clear. My mother was born in 1890. She was too young to be part of the NEM when it started, but she remembered the adults talking about it. When she was a girl, she said, it was dangerous work what they were doing. White authorities didn't want black children educated beyond basic labor skills. If they found out there was an organized system, people could lose their jobs, their homes. Worse things could happen too. Sarah leaned forward, not wanting to interrupt but desperate to hear more. The way my mother explained it, Lorraine continued, there were teachers, men and women who had gotten education somewhere, maybe in the North or through missionary schools. They couldn't teach openly, not the way they wanted to, so they created the network. They would identify families with children, approach them quietly, and offer instruction, reading, writing, arithmetic, but also history and science and literature, things that weren't taught in the colored schools. And the badges, Sarah prompted. The badges were for identification. Lorraine said if you wore one, it meant you were part of the network, either a teacher or a family that had been approved. It was a way to know who you could trust. My mother said her family didn't have the resources to pay the teachers, so they contributed in other ways. Her father was a blacksmith, and he made some of the badges himself. That's how she knew what the symbols meant. Lorraine reached for a notepad on the side table and drew with a shaky hand. The book, the torch, the interlocking links. The book is knowledge. The torch is enlightenment, bringing light into darkness. And the links represent the network itself, how they were all connected, supporting each other. No single link could hold everything together, but together they were strong. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Do you know what happened to the network after 1921? Lorraine's expression darkened. The massacre destroyed more than buildings. It destroyed trust, safety, community. People were scattered across the city and the state. Some never came back. The network couldn't operate the same way after that. Too many people dead or displaced, too much fear. But my mother said the teachers kept teaching, just in smaller groups, more carefully. The badge system ended, but the spirit of it continued. Robert brought them tea while Sarah took notes, her hand cramping from writing so quickly. Lorraine told stories her mother had passed down, about children learning to read by candlelight in church basements, about arithmetic lessons disguised as Bible study, about high school level instruction provided to teenagers whose official schooling had ended at 8th grade. The boy in the photograph, Sarah said, pointing to Daniel. Do you know anything about what happened to him? Lorraine studied the image, then shook her head. I don't recognize the family specifically, but Robert might be able to help you find descendants. There are still families in Tulsa whose grandparents survived the massacre. Over the next week, Sarah worked with Robert to identify potential descendants of the family in the photograph. Using census records, church membership rolls, and death certificates, they traced the family's movements through the decades. Thomas had died in 1923, likely from injuries or illness related to the massacre and its aftermath. Ruth had lived until 1945, working as a seamstress and continuing to teach neighborhood children informally until her death. But it was Daniel's story that proved most remarkable. Sarah found his name in the 1920 census, listed as a 24-year-old schoolteacher living in Muskogee, about 50 miles south of Tulsa. In 1925, he appeared in the records of the Dunbar School in Oklahoma City, identified as a principal. By 1930, He had moved to Topeka, Kansas, where he taught high school and became involved in the early legal challenges to school segregation. The trail grew clearer in the 1940s. Daniel had been one of the educators consulted by NAACP lawyers building the case for what would eventually become Brown v. Board of Education. His testimony about educational inequality in Oklahoma, rooted in decades of personal experience, had been cited in preliminary briefs. He died in 1951, 3 years before the Supreme Court's landmark decision. But his work had contributed to the foundation of that victory. Sarah sat in the archives late one evening, reading through old newspapers on microfilm, and found Daniel's obituary in the Kansas City Call, a black newspaper. The obituary mentioned his work in education, his advocacy for integration, and his commitment to ensuring every child had access to quality schooling. But there was one line that made Sarah's breath catch. Mistrita. Daniel credited his passion for education to his parents, who instilled in him from childhood the belief that knowledge was the most powerful tool for freedom. She thought of the 8-year-old boy in the photograph, wearing his badge with such seriousness, and understood that badge had represented more than an organization. It had represented a promise, a commitment passed from one generation to the next. Sarah finally located a living descendant through Robert's network of contacts. Daniel's granddaughter, Patricia, who was 73 and lived in Tulsa. When Sarah called to introduce herself and explain what she had discovered, Patricia was silent for a long moment. "I have some of my grandfather's papers," Patricia said finally. "He kept journals, letters. I've never known what to do with them, but I couldn't throw them away. Maybe now is the time to share them." The following Saturday, Sarah drove to Patricia's home in a quiet neighborhood in North Tulsa. Patricia met her at the door, a tall woman with silver hair and her grandfather's serious eyes. Inside, the walls were lined with family photographs spanning generations. Patricia led Sarah to a spare bedroom that served as a home office. On the desk sat 3 leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed but intact. Sarah sat at Patricia's dining table with a journal spread before her, handling them with the reverence they deserved. The first journal began in 1918, when Daniel was 22 and teaching at a rural school in Oklahoma. His handwriting was precise, each entry dated and carefully composed. But it was the second journal, started in 1920, that held the key to understanding the full story of the NEN. In an entry dated March 15, 1920, Daniel had written a reflection on his childhood that Sarah read aloud to Patricia. "I remember the day my mother pinned the badge to my shirt. I was 8 years old and proud to wear it, though I did not fully understand what it meant. She told me it was a symbol of a promise, that no matter what obstacles we faced, our community would find ways to pass knowledge forward." The NEN was born from necessity in 1899, when a group of teachers in Tulsa Massacre and boldly recognized that official channels for black education were closing even as our communities grew. They decided to create their own system, invisible to those who would stop them, sustained by families who understood that education was survival. Sarah paused, her throat tight with emotion. Patricia nodded for her to continue. "My parents were part of the NEN from its beginning. My father built the schoolrooms hidden in church basements. My mother taught literacy to children whose official schools stopped at 4th grade. They risked everything because they believed in the future. In my future, in the future of every child who wore that badge. When I became a teacher, I was fulfilling the promise they made when they joined that network. I am a link in the chain that cannot be broken." Sarah looked up from the journal to find Patricia wiping tears from her eyes. "I never knew," Patricia said softly. "I knew my grandfather was a teacher and an activist, But I didn't know about his parents, about the NEN, about how far back it all went. Together, they spent the afternoon going through the journals and the boxes of papers Patricia had preserved. They found letters from other NEN participants, describing the network's operations in different communities. They found a list of 127 names, the children who had been part of the program in 1904, including Daniel's own name. They found photographs, including one that showed Daniel as an adult wearing a suit and standing in front of a classroom with a small badge visible on his lapel. The same badge from the 1904 photograph. As the light faded outside, Sarah carefully repacked the documents, knowing they would need to be properly archived and preserved. But she left one item with Patricia, the original family photograph from 1904, now reunited with Daniel's journals and restored to his descendants. "This belongs with your family," Sarah said. "But I hope you'll allow us to share the story, to let people know what your great-grandparents and their community built, how they resisted oppression through education, how they created something that lasted generations." Patricia held the photograph gently, looking at the faces of ancestors she had never met, but whose legacy lived in her. "My grandfather used to tell me that knowledge passed forward is never lost. I understand now what he meant. Yes, share the story. Let people know what they did." 6 months later, the Oklahoma Historical Society opened an exhibition titled "The Badge of Knowledge: The Negro Education Network and Underground Schools of Oklahoma Territory, 1899–1925. The 1904 photograph held pride of place, with Daniel's badge visible in high resolution on a large display panel. Beside it were his journals, documents from church archives, oral histories collected from descendants of other NEM participants, and a carefully researched timeline of the network's operations. On opening night, Patricia stood beside Sarah, surrounded by other descendants of NEN families who had come forward after news of the discovery spread through the community. They shared stories their grandparents had told them, pieces of a puzzle that finally formed a complete picture. The network had operated for more than 25 years, teaching thousands of children, training teachers who would go on to challenge segregation laws, and laying groundwork for the civil rights battles that would come decades later. As Sarah looked at the photograph one more time, she thought of 8-year-old Daniel wearing his badge with pride, unaware that more than a century later, his image would reveal a hidden history of courage, resistance, and unbreakable determination. The badge he wore was more than metal and symbols. It was a promise kept across generations, a chain of knowledge that had never broken, even in the face of violence and oppression. The photograph had finally given up its secret, and in doing so, had restored honor and recognition to a community that had refused to let their children's futures be limited by the prejudices of their time. The NEN was no longer hidden. Its legacy was visible at last,